For 3 years, Ethan Carter carried the wreckage of a life he didn't know had been deliberately burned. His career? Gone. His savings? Vanished. His name? Dragged through mud he never touched. And the woman responsible? Dead. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because one afternoon, a stranger appeared at his door holding a box. And inside that box was the truth Victoria Hale had spent years burying, written in her own handwriting, signed with her own name. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The knock came at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, soft and unhurried, the kind of knock that didn't seem to expect an answer. Ethan heard it from the kitchen, where he was standing over the stove watching a pot of pasta water and thinking about absolutely nothing. That was something he'd gotten good at over the past 3 years. Emptying his mind until it was just white noise, just the sound of water beginning to bubble, just the small, ordinary rhythm of keeping himself and his daughter alive and moving through the day. He'd gotten so good at it that sometimes whole hours disappeared and he couldn't account for them. He wasn't proud of that, but he wasn't ashamed of it either. Surviving looked different depending on the day. He turned the burner to low and wiped his hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. His daughter Sophie was in her room doing homework, or at least she was supposed to be doing homework. She was 7, and the line between homework and drawing pictures of horses was blurry at best. "1 second," he called toward the door, even though no one in the hallway could have heard him. He checked the peephole out of habit. He always checked the peephole. The woman standing on the other side of his door was somewhere in her mid to late 60s, well-dressed in a gray coat, her silver hair pulled back with care. She was holding a cardboard box with both arms, the kind of medium-sized box that might contain old files or books, and she was looking directly at the peephole as though she knew someone was watching. Most people didn't do that. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He opened the door. "Ethan Carter?" she said. "Yeah." He leaned one hand against the doorframe. "Can I help you?" "My name is Eleanor Hale." She said it plainly, without drama, the way someone announces something they've rehearsed but still find painful. "I'm Victoria's mother." The pasta water on the stove behind him had gone quiet. He hadn't noticed when it stopped. He stood there for a moment that stretched too long, holding the door open, looking at the woman's face and looking for something in it. Some sign that he'd heard wrong, some indication that she meant a different Victoria, some other explanation. She had Victoria's cheekbones. He recognized that immediately and hated himself for noticing. "You should come in," he said finally, because he couldn't think of anything else. Oops. Eleanor Hale sat in one of the mismatched chairs at Ethan's kitchen table and set the box carefully on the surface between them, like she was placing something fragile. He made coffee he didn't particularly want and put a cup in front of her without asking, then sat down across from her and looked at the box. "I'm not sure where to start," she said. "Start with why you're here." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Victoria died 8 months ago. I assumed you'd heard." "I didn't." She absorbed this without expression. "It was a cardiac event, sudden. She was 30. The doctor said her heart had an abnormality she'd never been tested for." She paused. "She didn't suffer, they told me. I have no way of knowing if that's true or just what doctors say." He didn't know what to do with any of that information. He'd spent 3 years cultivating a specific kind of feelings toward Victoria Hale. Not hatred exactly, because hatred took energy, and he'd run out of energy a long time ago. More like a cold, flat distance, a deliberate severance. She had been a part of his life, and then she had destroyed that part of his life, and then she was gone from it. And he had learned to treat the entire chapter as something that happened to a different version of himself. Hearing that she was dead should have settled something. It didn't. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, because it was the only thing that made sense. "Are you?" He looked at her. "I'm not asking to be cruel," Eleanor said. "I'm asking because I know what she did to you, and I know that you have no reason to grieve her. So I would rather we not pretend." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Okay. She made me promise not to contact you while she was alive." Eleanor's voice was level, but her hands had tightened around the cup. "She told me it was complicated, and that you'd had a falling out, and that any contact from our family would only make things worse. She told me a lot of things I believed at the time. She stopped. I was her mother. I wanted to believe them. What changed? After she died, I had to go through her affairs. I'm the executor of her estate. She reached forward and touched the top of the box without opening it. I found things that I did not understand at first. Then I understood them. And then I had to decide what to do. And you decided to bring them here? I decided that a woman I loved very much did something that cannot be undone, and that the least I could do was make sure you had the truth of it. She met his eyes. I won't insult you by saying I'm sorry, because sorry isn't the right word. What she did goes past the reach of sorry. But I can give you this. She slid the box across the table toward him. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. There's documentation in there, Eleanor said. Financial records, correspondence, legal filings. An attorney I hired spent 6 weeks going through everything. He's the one who helped me understand the full shape of it. She hesitated. And there's a letter. She wrote it herself. I don't know when. She never told me about it. I found it with the rest of the documents. He put one hand on top of the box. The cardboard was soft with age. Does the attorney know you're here? He recommended against it, she said. He thought I should mail things through his office. I thought that was cowardly. He almost smiled at that. He didn't quite. I'll need some time with this, he said. Of course. Eleanor stood and straightened her coat. She moved slowly, deliberately, like a woman who had carried something heavy for a long time and was only now setting it down. I've included the attorney's contact information. He's available to speak with you whenever you're ready. She looked around the apartment briefly. At the stack of kids' books on the counter, at the drawing of a horse taped to the refrigerator, at the small signs of a life carefully reconstructed. Your daughter, she's here? In her room, Eleanor nodded. What's her name? Sophie. How old? 7. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Victoria knew about her. I think she thought about her more than she let herself admit. She looked at him and then away. That's not an excuse. I want you to know that whatever she wasn't entirely without a conscience. She just had learned very early how to overrule it. He walked her to the door. She stopped on the threshold and turned. I know this doesn't fix anything. No, he said, it doesn't. I know that you've spent 3 years. I'm going to need to read what's in the box before I can have this conversation, he said. Not unkindly, but firmly. I'm sorry. I need to see it first. Eleanor Hale nodded once. Then she was gone. Ethan stood at the closed door for almost 2 full minutes. Behind him, the pasta water had gone completely cold. From Sophie's room, he could hear the faint sound of her narrating something to herself, the way she did when she was drawing, a running commentary about whatever was happening in the picture, the horse with no name, the meadow that was also sometimes a forest, the adventure that had no beginning or an ending that he'd ever identified. He walked back to the kitchen table. He sat down. He looked at the box. He thought about 3 years ago. He thought about the morning he'd gone into work and been called into a conference room and been told that there were irregularities in an investment account that bore his name, that a joint venture he'd co-signed for had collapsed and left several parties significantly out of pocket, that the firm was cooperating with a preliminary inquiry and they needed him to step away while they looked into the situation. He thought about how HR had used the phrase step away when what they meant was, we're suspending you with cause. He thought about the way his manager, a man he'd worked beside for 4 years, hadn't met his eyes once during the entire conversation. He thought about standing outside the building afterward in the November cold with his phone in his hand, trying to call Victoria and getting voicemail. He'd called 11 times that day. Voicemail every time. He thought about the weeks that followed, his brother James pulling him aside and asking, with genuine confusion and something that looked a lot like hurt, why Ethan had borrowed money from him and never mentioned it. The amount James named. Ethan hadn't borrowed that. He hadn't borrowed anything. He hadn't even known the loan existed. He thought about Victoria when he'd finally reached her 3 days after the call. The way she'd sounded, calm, almost businesslike. When she told him that she'd done what she could, that the investment hadn't worked out the way either of them had hoped, that she was sorry it had come to this. She'd used the phrase come to this as though the whole thing were gravity, an inevitability, something no one could have prevented. He'd asked her directly, "Did you take the money?" She'd said, "Ethan, this isn't a conversation we should be having right now." That was the last time they'd spoken. He pulled the box toward him and lifted the lid. The documents were organized in file folders, each one labeled in the clean handwriting of someone's legal assistant. Eleanor's attorney had been thorough. Ethan had spent enough years in financial analysis to read this kind of documentation fluently, and he read it now the way he used to read prospectuses, slowly, starting with the summary, then working backward through the supporting evidence, looking for the seams where things didn't line up. He found plenty of seams. The first folder contained bank records, not his accounts. He'd spent the better part of a year during the investigation, letting auditors go through every account he'd ever touched, and they'd found nothing in his name that shouldn't have been there. These were different records. These were records from the joint venture account, an investment partnership called Meridian Capital Group that Ethan and Victoria had established together during the better period of their relationship, when they'd believed they were building something. He'd known the account existed. He'd reviewed the initial filings. He'd signed the partnership agreement. What he hadn't known was that 6 months after the account was opened, Victoria had established a secondary authorization structure on it, a set of permissions that allowed fund transfers above a certain threshold to be initiated by a single signature rather than both partners. According to the bank records, this structure had been added quietly, attached to a routine amendment that had come through in a stack of papers he'd signed at their attorney's office. He remembered signing papers. He remembered asking if there was anything he needed to review carefully. He remembered being told it was just administrative. He remembered trusting her. The secondary authorization had been used 11 times over the following 18 months. 11 separate transfers, each one large enough to matter, none of them large enough to trigger immediate automatic review. The money had gone into a holding entity called Clearwater Holdings, LLC, which Ethan had never heard of. He set that folder down and opened the next one. His hands were steady. He noticed this and found it strange. He'd expected to feel something immediate, rage maybe, or grief, or some complicated combination of both. Instead, he felt very focused and very cold, the way he used to feel during difficult earnings calls when everything depended on staying precise. His body was running old software, falling back on patterns from a version of himself that no longer existed. He let it. The second folder contained contracts. More specifically, it contained copies of contracts that bore his signature. He recognized some of them. Agreements from the early stages of the venture, partnership filings, a lease agreement for office space they'd shared briefly. He remembered signing all of those. He did not remember signing the others. 3 contracts with a private lending firm called Bridgepoint Financing, a promissory note issued in his name to a private individual named Gerald Mercer, a personal guarantee attached to a business loan that had been taken out under the name of a company he'd never worked for. His signature was on every single one of them. He picked up the promissory note and held it to the light. He had a distinctive signature. His last name started with a C that he'd developed a particular habit with, extending the top curve longer than most people did, something from an old penmanship class in middle school that had stuck. The signature on the promissory note got the C almost right. Not quite. The curve ended a half millimeter too early. He would never have noticed if he hadn't spent 3 years staring at his own name wondering what it meant. He put the note down and reached for the next folder. The third folder was correspondence. Emails, mostly, printed out and organized chronologically. He read the earliest ones first. They were from a company email address he'd never seen, associated with a domain that apparently belonged to one of Victoria's subsidiary businesses. The recipient was a man named Douglas Park, who turned out to be a former colleague of Ethan's, a mid-level manager at his old firm who'd been one of the first people to provide a statement to HR during the initial investigation. Douglas had told the firm that he'd personally heard Ethan discussing the joint venture in ways that seemed, in retrospect, to suggest Ethan had been moving money. Douglas's statement had been one of several pieces of circumstantial mud that had made it very difficult for Ethan to argue his case. The emails between the company account and Douglas Park went back 18 months before the collapse. He read them carefully. They were not the emails of someone who'd spontaneously decided to give a statement. They read like a long, patient process of cultivation. Whoever had written from the company account, and it wasn't hard to guess who, given what he already knew, had spent a year and a half building a relationship with Douglas Park, supplying him with small favors, pieces of professional advice, introductions to useful contacts. Douglas's emails in return grew progressively warmer. He began sharing things he probably shouldn't have: office gossip, internal commentary, minor complaints about colleagues. And then, carefully, the emails began shaping Douglas's perception of Ethan. Nothing direct. Nothing that could be called an instruction. Just a long, patient accumulation of doubt. He always seemed more interested in the return than in the process, doesn't he? And then, sometimes I wonder if people like that know where the line is. And then, 4 months before the collapse, I suppose the investigation will tell us what we need to know. Douglas Park had been primed for over a year before he'd ever walked into an HR office. Ethan put that folder down and looked at the wall for a moment. He thought about Douglas. He'd never particularly liked the man, but they'd had a functional professional relationship, and he'd never had any reason to think Douglas bore him ill will. He wondered what Douglas knew now, 3 years later. Whether Douglas had ever looked at those emails and understood what had happened to him. Whether Douglas had been a knowing participant or just a piece that someone else had moved across a board. He picked up the 4th folder. He was still reading when Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a drawing and wearing the slightly suspicious expression she got when dinner time had passed and nobody had announced it. "Dad?" "Yeah, Bug." He didn't look up. "It's 6:30. "I know." "You said pasta." "Right." He closed the folder carefully and set it on top of the others. He stood, and the stiffness in his back told him he'd been sitting in one position for over 2 hours. "Give me 5 minutes." Sophie surveyed the box on the table with the unsentimental practicality of a 7-year-old. "What's in that?" "Work stuff." "You don't have work stuff." "I used to." He moved to the stove and turned the burner back on. The water in the pot was stone cold. He dumped it in the sink and started fresh. "What did you draw?" She held it up. It was a horse, black, with a mane that appeared to contain several shades of color she'd labeled carefully in her own handwriting. Brown, yellow, reed. "What's his name?" He got the colander out of the cabinet. "Comet. But she's a girl." "My mistake." "What does Comet do?" "She lives in the mountains, and she's fast, and she doesn't let people ride her unless they've earned it." Sophie set the drawing on the counter with the gravity of someone presenting a document for the record. "She's very particular." "Sounds like it." Sophie climbed onto the counter stool that he'd put there specifically so she could watch him cook. This was one of their rituals. The stool, the counter, the narration. He found it stabilizing in a way he'd never have admitted to another adult. "A lady came," Sophie said. He looked at her. "You saw her?" "I heard her. I wasn't eavesdropping." A pause. "I looked through the crack." He turned back to the stove. "She was someone from a long time ago." "Before me?" "Yeah, before you." Sophie processed this. "Was she mean?" He thought about Eleanor Hale's face, the way she'd set the box down, the way she'd said, "I know this doesn't fix anything." "No," he said. "She wasn't." "Then why do you look like that?" He looked at his daughter. She was watching him with those dark, direct eyes that still surprised him sometimes. She had his eyes. People always said so, but they didn't look like his eyes looked in the mirror. They looked more awake, more like someone who hadn't yet learned to look away from things. "I look like what?" "Like when you're trying to figure something out," she said. "Like when you're solving a problem that's hard." He turned back to the water. "Maybe I am." "Is it bad?" He thought about the forged signature, the promissory note, the emails to Douglas Park. He thought about the Clearwater Holdings, LLC, and the 11 transfers and the careful, invisible architecture of a collapse that had been planned long before it happened. "It's complicated," he said, "but I think—" He stopped. He started again. "I think it might turn out okay. Eventually." "Eventually is not now," Sophie observed. "No, it's not." She seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer. She picked up her drawing of Comet and began adding detail to the background. Mountains, he thought, or maybe clouds. The horse with no rider standing in a landscape that was still being decided. He put the pasta in when the water boiled and stood at the stove and thought. He didn't open the box again until Sophie was asleep. He'd put her to bed at 8:30, sat through 2 pages of the book they were reading together, something with a rabbit and a castle and a mystery that seemed to be getting more elaborate with every chapter, and waited until her breathing went deep and even before he quietly closed her door and went back to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of coffee. He sat down. He took the last folder out of the box. This one didn't have a label. Inside was a single envelope, unsealed, with his name written on the front. His full name, Ethan James Carter. In handwriting he recognized. He had a stack of old birthday cards in a shoebox in his closet. Cards from before everything fell apart. From the brief and apparently illusory period when he'd believed he was building a life with someone. He'd kept them not because he was sentimental about the relationship, but because he hadn't been able to bring himself to throw out the only physical evidence that it had existed. He hadn't looked at them in 2 years, but he knew her handwriting. He'd spent enough time looking at it across enough tables. He held the envelope and didn't open it for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator in the corner ticked. Sophie's drawing of Comet, she'd insisted on taping it to the refrigerator before bed, moved slightly in some draft that came from somewhere. He opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages long, written on her personal stationery. She'd always had personal stationery. It had seemed like an affectation to him once. Now it just seemed like a detail from a world that no longer existed. Her handwriting was smaller than usual, compressed, as though she'd started with the intention of keeping it brief and then found that the truth took up more space than she'd planned. He read it once, quickly, getting the shape of it. Then he read it again, slowly, from the beginning. Ethan, I don't know who I'm writing this to. I started it as a letter to you, but I'm not going to send it, so I suppose I'm writing it to myself, which is something I've avoided for most of my adult life because I'm not sure I would like what I found. I need to say some things about Meridian, about all of it. I need to say them somewhere, even if you never read them, because I've been carrying them for 3 years and I think I might be starting to understand that things don't disappear just because you refuse to acknowledge them. The structure we used to move the money, the secondary authorization, the Clearwater entity. I had that set up before we ever launched Meridian together, before you signed any papers. I want to be accurate about the sequence because accuracy is something I'm trying to learn, late and inadequately. The plan existed before the partnership. The partnership was partly how I executed the plan. That's not a comfortable thing to write. The forged contracts, the Bridgepoint agreements, the Mercer note. I had a notary I'd used before on other business. I'm not going to write his name here. He knew what he was doing. I provided the signature samples. He was very good. I imagine you looked at those documents and found nothing wrong with them. I had people inside your firm, not people I paid directly. It's more accurate to say I had people I'd cultivated over time, people who trusted my professional judgment and had their own reasons for being willing to see the worst in someone who was slightly more successful than them. Douglas Park was not the only one. He was just the most useful. I told your brother that you'd asked me to handle the loan arrangement because you were embarrassed about the amount. I told him you'd asked me to keep it quiet because you didn't want to make things awkward between you. James was generous and he trusted you. And he trusted me because I was the person you'd chosen. I use that. I'm going to stop listing the individual components now because it's starting to feel like I'm building a case against myself, and I don't think that's what this is supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be something else, though I'm not sure I have the vocabulary for it. Here is what I know. I built it carefully. I built it over 18 months. I had help I paid for and help I didn't pay for, and I used the resources I had, which were substantial. I had good reasons. They were not good enough reasons. I'm not sure what good enough would have looked like, but I've spent enough time looking at what I did that I can tell it wasn't that. I know that Sophie exists. I know she's young. I know you've spent 3 years being the only person between her and the world, and I know that the reason those 3 years were as hard as they were is because I made choices that removed all the scaffolding from your life. I want you to know that I think about her. I'm not asking for anything from that. I just want it said. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to. I'm not sure forgiveness is something I've earned the right to request. What I'm asking is that you know that somewhere there exists an honest account of what happened, because I did not leave you with an honest account, and that absence was its own cruelty. The truth is that I planned it. I executed it. The collapse of everything you built was not a coincidence or a failure or a tragic misunderstanding. It was something I made happen. I'm sorry is a small phrase for a large thing, I know that. V. He put the letter down on the table. He sat there for a long time. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel reading it. Something, probably. He'd thought it would crack something open, or rage, or grief, or some cathartic moment of release. What he actually felt was quieter and stranger than any of those things. He felt the specific sensation of a question he'd been holding for 3 years finally receiving an answer. Did I do something to cause this? He'd asked himself that question more times than he could count. In the middle of nights, he couldn't sleep through. At the edges of his daughter's birthday parties when he was supposed to be present, and was instead somewhere inside himself trying to work out the math. He'd turned his own history over and over looking for the error, the moment where he'd made a choice that could have set everything in motion. He'd consulted the wreckage of his life looking for fingerprints that belonged to him. Now he had an answer. The fingerprints didn't belong to him. He didn't feel better, exactly. He felt like a man who had been standing in a room pushing against a wall for 3 years and has just been told that the wall is a door and that it opens outward. Not easier, just different, just oriented in a direction that had possibility in it. He picked up the folder with the attorney's contact information. The name on the card was Raymond Kowalski. There was a cell phone number below the office number and a note in Eleanor's handwriting that said, "Call any time. He's expecting to hear from you." He looked at the card for a long moment. He looked at Sophie's drawing of Comet on the refrigerator, the horse with the multicolored mane, brown, yellow, reed, the mountains, or maybe clouds, that were still being decided. He looked back at the card. He set it down on top of the letter and went to bed, because it was nearly midnight and he had work in the morning, the data entry consulting work that paid exactly enough to keep them stable if nothing unexpected happened, and because the attorney could wait until tomorrow. But he put the card on his nightstand instead of leaving it in the kitchen. And when he woke up at 5 in the morning, which he always did, he lay there in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not relief. Something more preliminary than either of those. Something that felt, cautiously, like the first dim outline of an opening. He called Raymond Kowalski at 8:15 in the morning, before Sophie was awake, standing on the small balcony with his coffee and watching the city begin its day below him. The attorney picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Carter," he said. Not a question. Eleanor had clearly warned him. "You've seen everything in the box," Ethan said. "I compiled everything in the box, along with 2 junior associates who spent a very interesting 6 weeks. Yes." "Is there a case?" Kowalski paused. It wasn't the pause of someone who didn't know the answer. It was the pause of someone choosing how to frame it. "The fraudulent contracts are invalidatable. Clear evidence of signature forgery. We have the original signature samples and can get expert testimony. The wire transfers through Clearwater Holdings are documented in a way that traces back to the Meridian account. The loan instruments created in your name without your authorization can be challenged." Another pause. "And there is the matter of the letter." What about the letter? A voluntary written confession in the hand of the person responsible is not a document that opposing counsel will enjoy dealing with. He said it without satisfaction, just as plain fact. The estate has assets, significant ones. Victoria Hale was worth a great deal of money when she died, and the estate has been in probate for 8 months. Eleanor is the primary beneficiary, but she's also, as executor, empowered to direct certain settlement actions, meaning she can agree to pay back what was taken, meaning she has already indicated to me her intent to do so to the fullest extent the estate allows. Yes. Ethan drank his coffee. Down in the street, a delivery truck was attempting a turn that seemed optimistic given the width of the road. "My name," he said. "My professional reputation. That's not something you can settle in court." "No," Kowalski said. But your former employer is still operating. Their internal investigation 3 years ago was predicated on information we now know was manufactured. If approached correctly, with this documentation, and particularly with the letter, they have significant incentive to reopen that review and arrive at a different conclusion. He paused again. Institutions don't like discovering they were used. It makes them want to be seen as correcting the record. Ethan leaned on the balcony railing and looked at the city. How long? He said. For what specifically? For any of it. For something to actually change. Legal timelines are, I know what they are, roughly, best case. Kowalski considered. If the estate doesn't contest, and Eleanor's cooperation makes that likely, the financial components could resolve within 6 to 8 months. Your employer review would be separate. That I can't promise you a timeline on. 6 to 8 months. He thought about that. He'd already survived 3 years. He could survive 6 more months. Okay, he said. You want to proceed? I want to proceed. I'll need to meet with you. This week, if possible. I can come to you. Thursday, Ethan said. My daughter's at school until 3. Thursday at 10, Kowalski said. I'll bring everything. Ethan said goodbye and ended the call and stood on the balcony a moment longer. Behind him, through the glass door, he could hear Sophie beginning to move around in her room. The specific sound of a 7-year-old negotiating her way from sleep to morning, the thump of feet on the floor, the creak of her closet door, the muffled sound of her narrating something to herself. He had told her, last night, that things were complicated. He thought that was still true, but complicated was not the same as impossible, and he was starting very carefully to understand the difference. He went inside to make breakfast. Raymond Kowalski was not what Ethan had pictured. He'd expected someone polished, the kind of attorney who wore cufflinks and spoke in full paragraphs and made you feel slightly underdressed in your own home. What showed up Thursday morning was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a rumpled sport coat, a briefcase that had clearly been through significant use, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent enough years in courtrooms to stop performing competence and just practice it. He shook Ethan's hand at the door and looked around the apartment without comment. Coffee? Ethan offered. Please. Black. He set his briefcase on the kitchen table and unlatched it with the ease of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Eleanor said you read everything Thursday night. Most of it, including the letter. Including the letter? Kowalski glanced at him briefly. How are you doing with that? It was a straightforward question, and Ethan appreciated that it wasn't dressed up as anything else. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I think I'm still in the part where I'm trying to understand the full dimensions of it before I feel it. That's a reasonable place to be. The attorney spread several folders across the table in a sequence that suggested he'd ordered them deliberately. Sit down. I want to walk you through what we have, because I think the picture is more complete than you realized last night. Ethan sat. He put the coffees down and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Start wherever you need to, he said. Kowalski opened the first folder. Let's start with money, because money is the most straightforward part of this. He turned the folder toward Ethan. The Meridian Capital Group account. You and Victoria established it with an initial combined investment of $400,000. Your contribution was $200,000, the sum total of your liquid savings at that point, plus a small inheritance from your grandfather. Yes. Over the 18 months following the account's establishment, 11 transfers moved a combined total of $312,000 from the Meridian account into the Clearwater Holdings entity. He pointed to the column of figures on the document. Of that $312,000, the portion attributable to your original investment, the money that was yours, accounts for approximately $180,000. Ethan looked at the figure. He'd seen it the night before, but it still landed differently when someone said it out loud across a table. The remainder, Kowalski continued, was generated by investment returns during that period. The Meridian account performed well. Ironically, you were both good at that part. The returns were legitimate. The mechanism used to move them was not. What happened to the Clearwater money? Clearwater was dissolved 14 months after the last transfer. The funds were moved through two additional holding entities before landing in accounts connected to a subsidiary of Victoria's primary business holdings. He paused. Her estate currently holds assets of approximately $4.2 million, net of debts and taxes. Eleanor, as executor, has already indicated her intention to prioritize restitution. The recoverable amount from your original investment, plus interest calculated at standard rates for the period, comes to approximately $230,000. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's not everything. No, it's not. The fraudulent loans are a separate matter. Kowalski opened the second folder. 3 loan instruments were created in your name without your authorization. The Bridgepoint agreements, the Mercer note you've seen, and a third, a commercial guarantee attached to a business loan for an LLC called Hartfield Solutions. Are you familiar with that name? No. Hartfield Solutions was a small logistics company that operated for approximately 2 years and then failed. The loan it took out, guaranteed in your name, was never repaid. The lender eventually wrote it off as a loss, but not before your name appeared in their collections records. Kowalski looked at him steadily. You are aware that your credit was significantly damaged during this period. I am aware, yes. The guarantee is the primary reason why. The Bridgepoint agreements created debt on paper that appeared to be yours, but the Mercer note and the Hartfield guarantee are what actually moved through credit reporting systems. He closed the second folder and opened a third. With the documentation we have, particularly the expert analysis of the forged signatures, which is unambiguous, we can challenge all 3 instruments and have them voided. The credit damage is correctable. It will take time, but it is correctable. Ethan picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. And my brother's money? Kowalski nodded slowly. James Carter. Yes. He reached into the briefcase and produced a document Ethan hadn't seen in the box. This is a statement your brother gave during the original investigation, confirming that he had lent money at your request. The amount was $45,000. He set the document on the table. I spoke with Eleanor about this specifically. The estate will cover the repayment to your brother directly, with interest. Ethan looked at the document, James's handwriting on the signature line. James, who had lent the money without a second thought because it was his brother, who had spent the following 3 years not quite meeting Ethan's eyes at family dinners, who had never said outright that he believed Ethan had taken the money and just never paid it back, but whose silence on the subject had said enough. He thought I just didn't pay him back, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Based on what he was told at the time, that would have been the reasonable conclusion. She told him I was embarrassed about the amount, that I'd asked her to handle it. Yes, I saw that in the letter. And he believed her. He set the coffee down. Because why wouldn't he? She was the person I'd chosen. That's what she said in the letter. She used that. Kowalski let that sit for a moment without filling the silence, which Ethan found he was grateful for. There's something else, the attorney said after a moment. Something I want to make sure you understand, because it's the piece that took my associates the longest to fully map. He reached for the folder with the correspondence, the emails to Douglas Park and the others. He spread several pages out in a sequence. The cultivation of internal witnesses at your firm was more extensive than the Douglas Park correspondence suggests. We identified at least 2 other individuals who received similar treatment over a similar timeline. One is a woman named Priya Solanki, who was a compliance officer at your firm and who provided a supporting statement during the investigation. The other is a man named Christopher Wald, who was on the board of the industry association that revoked your analyst certification. Ethan stared at the pages. I didn't know about Wald. No, he was careful. Or rather, she was careful about how that relationship was managed. The correspondence with Wald doesn't have the same texture as the Park emails. It's more oblique, but the pattern is clear once you know what you're looking at. Kowalski gathered the pages back into the folder. What I want you to understand is the scope. This wasn't opportunistic. It wasn't a panicked cover-up after something went wrong. The infrastructure was built first. The outcome you experienced was the intended outcome, planned and executed over approximately 2 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked at the wall above Kowalski's shoulder. There was a mark there he'd been meaning to paint over since they moved in, a scuff from when he'd moved the bookshelf and misjudged the angle. He'd never gotten around to it. He looked at it now because it gave his eyes somewhere to land. "Why?" he said. Kowalski looked at him. "That's the part I keep coming back to," Ethan said. "I understand the money. I understand that she needed a vehicle to move it, and I was useful. I understand she needed someone to take the blame. But the scope of it, the 2 years of setup, the cultivated witnesses, the forged contracts, the manufactured debt." He looked back at the attorney. "Why go to that much trouble? Why not just take the money and dissolve the partnership and walk away? Why did she need to destroy my reputation in the process?" Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "That's not a legal question." "I know it's not. Eleanor has a theory. She shared it with me." He paused. "Whether it satisfies you is another matter, but she believes Victoria needed the narrative. Not just the money. She needed a story that explained why the venture failed and who was responsible. A story she could tell the financial world, her investors, her board. The story only worked if you were convincingly at fault." He looked at Ethan carefully. "The more thoroughly you were discredited, the more cleanly the story held." Ethan absorbed that. She couldn't just let it be a failed investment. She had investors who expected better. She had a reputation that depended on her judgment being impeccable. A failed venture with a discredited partner is different from a failed venture. One is bad luck. The other is someone else's fault. Kowalski paused. She was very good at protecting her own image. That much is evident. Until she wasn't. Until she wrote a letter she apparently intended to destroy, and then didn't. That detail had nagged at Ethan since he'd first read the letter. The envelope unsealed. His full name on the front. Why keep it at all? Why write it in the first place if you never intended it to reach anyone? He didn't ask Kowalski that. He didn't think it was a question the attorney could answer. "What do we do first?" Ethan asked instead. "We file a petition to invalidate the fraudulent loan instruments. That's the most time-sensitive piece. Your credit situation is ongoing, and addressing it sooner matters. Simultaneously, I'll be in formal communication with Victoria's estate attorney to begin the restitution process." He gathered the folders back into a neat stack. "And I'd like, with your permission, to reach out to your former employer. Not with a legal demand. Not yet. With a letter and the documentation. Something that gives them the opportunity to do the right thing voluntarily before it becomes a legal question." "You think they will?" "I think they'll want to. Nobody wants to be the institution that destroyed a man's career on the basis of manufactured evidence." He clicked the briefcase shut. "I've seen institutions do surprising things when the alternative is bad press." Ethan nodded slowly. "Okay, yes, do all of it." Kowalski stood and put on his coat. He moved toward the door and then stopped. "One more thing. Victoria's cousin has been helping Eleanor with the estate, a woman named Madeline Brooks. She's the one who first flagged the financial irregularities to Eleanor. She noticed something off in the estate records that Eleanor might have missed. She's not an attorney, but she's thorough." He paused. "She may reach out to you at some point. Just wanted you to know her name in case she does." "Why would she reach out?" "There are some questions about the Clearwater Holdings dissolution, some documentation gaps that Madeline thinks might help us reconstruct the full transfer chain. She may want to ask you about the early days of the Meridian account, things you might remember from that period." He shrugged. "Just context." Ethan held the door open. Madeline Brooks. Urban planner, professionally, very methodical. Eleanor trusts her completely. He stepped into the hallway. "I'll be in touch by end of week." After the attorney left, Ethan stood in the kitchen and looked at the empty table where the folders had been spread out like the blueprints of a disaster. He thought about 2 years of careful construction. He thought about Douglas Park being shaped, slowly, across 18 months of curated emails, into someone who would walk into an HR office and say the right damaging things. He thought about Christopher Wald, the name he hadn't known until this morning, placed carefully on the board of a professional association, primed with small doubts that would compound over time into a revocation. He thought about the fact that while all of that was being built, he had been sitting across dinner tables from Victoria Hale and talking about their future. He picked up his phone and called his brother. James answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the usual background noise of whatever job site he was working. James did construction management, an honest physical job that Ethan had sometimes envied for its clarity. "Hey," James said. "You okay?" "Yeah, I need to tell you something. It's going to take a little while." A pause. The background noise diminished, James stepping somewhere quieter. "Okay, I'm listening," he told him. Not everything, not every detail from the folders, but the essential truth of it. The forged documents, the loan that had been taken in Ethan's name without his knowledge, the explanation Victoria had given James about Ethan being embarrassed, asking her to handle it quietly. He told James the money was going to be paid back, with interest, through the estate. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Ethan would have checked if the call had dropped, except he could still hear his brother breathing. "James? I'm here." His voice was different, compressed. "I'm just... Give me a second." "Yeah. I thought..." Another pause. "I mean, I told myself I didn't think you'd just take it and not say anything. I told myself there had to be an explanation, but then time kept going and you never brought it up, and I..." He stopped. "I believed her, Ethan. She called me personally. She was very convincing." "I know. I didn't say anything to you because I didn't want to make things worse, and I thought maybe you'd bring it up when you were ready, and then you never did, and I..." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "I've been carrying this around for 3 years thinking my brother just didn't respect me enough to pay back $45,000. "I know," Ethan said again. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know until yesterday." "Stop apologizing. You didn't do anything." Another silence. "She's really dead?" "She's really dead." "Huh." James's voice was flat in the particular way of someone trying to sort through what they're supposed to feel about news like that. "I don't know what to do with that." "Neither do I." "What happens now?" "The attorney works on the legal side. The money comes back. My name gets cleared, hopefully." He looked at the refrigerator. Comet the horse, with the multicolored mane. "Things go back to being what they actually were. Does that fix 3 years?" "No," Ethan said. "It doesn't fix 3 years." James was quiet. "I'm coming over this weekend. I want to see Sophie. She'd like that. And I want to buy you a beer and sit somewhere and not talk about any of this for a few hours." Ethan felt something loosen slightly in his chest. "Yeah," he said. "That works." After he hung up, he stayed at the kitchen table for another few minutes. The apartment was quiet in the way it always was mid-morning when Sophie was at school, a specific quality of silence that was both restful and slightly too empty. He'd gotten used to it, the same way he'd gotten used to most things about this particular life. Not with happiness, exactly. With the competence of someone who has learned the practical requirements of the situation. He thought about Madeline Brooks. The name sitting at the edge of everything Kowalski had told him. A person who had noticed something off in estate records, who was methodical, who Eleanor trusted completely. He thought about the fact that she had helped surface the truth before Eleanor had known the full shape of it, which meant she'd done it without knowing what she was looking for, following something that just didn't add up. He found, to his mild surprise, that he was curious about her, not in any particular way. Just the way you were curious about anyone who had, without knowing it, changed the direction of your life. He wondered what it had looked like from her side, going through a dead cousin's estate records, finding something that didn't fit, following the thread without knowing where it led. He wondered if she'd understood what she was uncovering as she uncovered it, or if it had arrived all at once, the way it had for Eleanor. He filed the curiosity away and went to work. He had data entry to finish by 5 o'clock, and a conference call that would last exactly as long as these calls always lasted, which was longer than necessary, and a grocery run before Sophie got out of school because they were out of the particular brand of pasta she'd decided was the only acceptable kind. The ordinary machinery of the day continued its operation regardless of what had been overturned in his understanding of the past 3 years. He'd learned that a long time ago, and it had stopped surprising him. He worked through the afternoon with a steadiness that he recognized as a kind of shock response, his nervous system keeping things orderly because disorder was not useful. And he picked Sophie up from school at 3:15 and listened to her detailed account of an argument she'd had with a classmate over the correct way to draw a horse's legs. "There are 4 of them," Sophie said, with the gravity of someone presenting empirical fact. And they go like this. She demonstrated with her arm, which didn't clarify anything. That sounds like a lot to keep track of, Ethan said. It's not that hard. You just have to look at an actual horse. Have you looked at an actual horse? She considered this. I've looked at pictures. That might be the issue. It is not the issue, she said firmly, and he let it go. He made dinner. He helped Sophie with subtraction, which she found less interesting than horses, but more interesting than reading comprehension. He read her 2 chapters of the Rabbit and Castle book, and when she fell asleep, he went back to the kitchen and sat with a glass of water and thought about Raymond Kowalski's voice saying approximately $230,000, and the infrastructure was built first. He thought about the version of himself who had stood outside his office building in November 3 years ago, with his phone in his hand, calling Victoria's number again and again. He thought about how certain that version of himself had been, that there was an explanation, that something had gone wrong, something had been misunderstood, something could be corrected if he could just get her on the phone. The belief in an explanation had been almost physical, a thing he'd held on to like a handhold on a wall. The explanation existed. It had always existed. He just hadn't been allowed to have it. He sat with that for a while. Not comfortably, but honestly. Then he rinsed his glass and went to bed and lay there in the dark and thought about the future for the first time in 3 years as though it were something that might actually belong to him. It was an unfamiliar sensation. He didn't trust it yet, but he didn't push it away either. The call from Madeline Brooks came on a Wednesday, 11 days after Kowalski's visit. Ethan was in the middle of a conference call he didn't need to be paying close attention to, the kind where 3 people talked in circles about a deliverable that had already been decided. So he was half listening to his laptop while reading the preliminary filing Kowalski had emailed that morning, and when his phone buzzed with an unknown number, he almost let it go to voicemail. He answered it. "Is this Ethan Carter?" The voice was direct, not unfriendly, but not performing warmth either. A voice that got to the point because it assumed the point was worth getting to. "It is. My name is Madeline Brooks. Raymond Kowalski said he mentioned me." "He did." Ethan pushed back from the desk and walked toward the kitchen, away from the laptop. "He said you found something in the estate records." "I found a discrepancy," she said. "Whether it's something useful is what I wanted to ask you about." A brief pause. "I know this is probably not a conversation you were looking forward to. I'll keep it as short as I can." "I appreciate that." The Clearwater Holdings dissolution, Kowalski has the transfer record showing money moving into Clearwater, but the documentation around the dissolution itself has a gap. Specifically, there's a 3-week window between the last transfer and the point where the entity was formally wound down, and we're missing the internal records from that window. I think those records would help establish intent, that the structure was set up to permanently divert the funds, not just temporarily hold them, which matters for the fraud characterization. He leaned against the kitchen counter. "What do you need from me?" "I need to know if Victoria ever mentioned a company called Redgate Advisory Group in your presence. It would have been around the time you were still working together, before the partnership collapsed." He thought about it. He tried to be honest with himself about what he actually remembered versus what he thought he should remember. "The name doesn't mean anything to me," he said, "but I can't rule it out. That was a period where there were a lot of names being mentioned. I wasn't always tracking all of them." "That's fair." She didn't sound disappointed. She sounded like someone who had anticipated that answer and had a next question prepared. "Is there anyone from that time who might have been in meetings you weren't? Someone she dealt with on the business side who might remember?" "There was a woman named Carol Ferris. She was Victoria's executive assistant. She was in most of her external meetings." He hesitated. "I don't know if she's still in touch with anyone from that world." "Do you have contact information for her?" "I might have an old email address. I'd have to look." "If you find it, send it to Kowalski. He can follow up." Another pause, shorter this time. "I know this is a strange situation. For the record, I'm not doing this because I feel obligated to Eleanor, though I do. I'm doing it because what I found in those records was genuinely appalling, and I think people who do appalling things should have to account for them even when they're not around to do it in person." He looked out the kitchen window at the building across the street, where someone was washing their windows on the 4th floor with a methodical back-and-forth motion. "How long have you known about this? About what Victoria did?" a beat. Eleanor showed me the letter about 6 weeks ago. Before that, I knew something was off in the financials, but I didn't have the full picture. She paused. I knew Victoria reasonably well growing up. Not well enough, apparently. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. It changes how you remember things, Madeline said quietly. When you find out someone you knew was capable of something like this, you go back through your memories and you start looking at them differently, wondering what was real and what was constructed. She stopped herself. Sorry, that's probably not helpful to you right now. No, he said. It's actually exactly what it's like. A silence that was not uncomfortable. I'll look for Carol Ferris's contact information, he said. Thank you. And Mr. Carter, she paused in the way of someone deciding how much to say. For what it's worth, what's in those documents is unambiguous. I know it's not over yet, and I know unambiguous doesn't immediately fix anything, but you didn't imagine it, and you didn't cause it, and sometimes it matters to have someone say that plainly. He stood in his kitchen for a moment after they hung up, holding the phone. He thought, that was a person who means what she says. It was not a complicated thought. It was just the first impression of someone he'd spoken to for 8 minutes, and first impressions were frequently wrong, and it didn't mean anything beyond that. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to his conference call, which had progressed to the stage where people were agreeing with each other more emphatically than necessary, and he tuned back in and contributed 2 sentences and let the remaining 20 minutes pass. 3 weeks after that call, Kowalski filed the petition to invalidate the fraudulent loan instruments. Ethan wasn't in the courtroom. It was procedural, Kowalski told him, nothing he needed to be present for. But he sat at his desk that morning knowing the filing was happening and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not relief, something more preliminary. The sensation of a process beginning that would eventually, if everything went correctly, arrive somewhere he'd stopped believing he could go. The estate attorney responded within 10 days. The response was, as Kowalski had predicted, largely cooperative. Victoria's estate had no interest in contesting documentation this clear, and Eleanor's instructions had apparently been communicated unambiguously. The letter, Kowalski told him, had done significant work in that room. Her own attorney was uncomfortable, Kowalski said, with a dryness that suggested he'd found this appropriate. He knew his client had written a confession. There's not much argument to be made against that. What followed was not a clean or cinematic process. It was paperwork, and then more paperwork, and phone calls, and waiting. A credit bureau dispute that required documentation Ethan had to locate in a box he hadn't opened in 2 years. A formal request from Bridgepoint Financing for supporting evidence that took Kowalski's office 3 weeks to compile and submit. An exchange of letters with the Mercer estate. The promissory note had been held by Gerald Mercer's family since Mercer's own death the previous year. That was both legally tedious and quietly depressing in the way that all transactions involving dead people were. Ethan went through it methodically. He handled what he was asked to handle and let the attorney handle the rest, and he got Sophie to school and picked her up and made dinner and read chapters of the Rabbit and Castle book and didn't let himself spend too much time thinking about outcomes he couldn't control. James came on the weekend, as promised. He showed up with a 6-pack and a bag of groceries that turned out to contain the ingredients for the specific chili their mother used to make. Not because they'd discussed it, just because James had decided it seemed right. They cooked together in the small kitchen, and Sophie sat on the counter stool and supervised with unsolicited opinions about the amount of cumin, and after dinner she made James look at every drawing she'd produced in the last month, which took 45 minutes and James's full attention, which he gave without complaint because he was that kind of uncle. When Sophie was in bed, James and Ethan sat in the living room with what was left of the beer and didn't talk about Victoria or the estate or any of it for almost an hour. They talked about their mother, who was fine, who asked about Sophie constantly and was lobbying to take her for a long weekend, which Ethan was considering. They talked about a job site James was managing in the north end of the city and the particular challenge of the site supervisor who communicated exclusively in passive-aggressive emails. They talked about a movie they'd both apparently been meaning to watch for 2 years and hadn't. Then James set his bottle down and looked at his hands for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "During those 3 years, When you thought I might be, when you knew I believed you'd taken the money. He looked up. Why didn't you just say something? Just come out and say, James, I never borrowed anything from you. I don't know what you're talking about. Ethan thought about that. He'd thought about it before, but he tried to think about it honestly now, in the way he was trying to be honest about most things. Because by the time I understood you thought I'd taken it, I'd already had 100 conversations where I said I didn't do things I actually hadn't done. And people looked at me the way you do when you're deciding whether to believe someone, and most of them decided not to. He picked at the label on his bottle. I was tired of being the person who kept saying I didn't do it. I thought if the truth was going to come out, it was going to have to come from somewhere other than me. James was quiet for a moment. That's a terrible position to be in. Yes. I should have asked you directly. I kept telling myself I was giving you space. He shook his head. I was giving myself space from an uncomfortable conversation. You believe someone who gave you a very convincing story. I believed her over my own brother. She was good at it, Ethan said. She spent 2 years being good at it. He looked at his brother. I'm not interested in carrying it, James. That's not where I want to put my energy. James looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and picked his beer back up. Okay. They watched half the movie they'd been meaning to watch, and then James fell asleep on the couch, which he'd been doing at Ethan's since they were teenagers, and Ethan put a blanket over him and went to bed. It was during this period, the waiting, the paperwork, the slow procedural grind of undoing what had been built against him, that Madeline Brooks called again. She'd found Carol Ferris, or rather, Carol Ferris had found them. She'd received Kowalski's email and responded within a day, apparently because she'd had her own complicated feelings about Victoria Hale that she'd been carrying without an outlet for some time. She mentioned Redgate Advisory Group, Madeline said. She was speaking quickly but precisely, the way someone does when they've found the thing they were looking for and are keeping their excitement professional. It was a financial advisory firm Victoria used for about 8 months around the time the Clearwater entity was established. Carol was in 3 meetings with their representative. She remembers the name. And she remembers that the meetings were not about anything that would normally require an executive assistant to be present. They were internal strategy discussions, the kind Victoria usually held with just her core team. She was keeping Carol close, Ethan said. That's my read too. Making sure there was a witness who could confirm the meetings happened, but who didn't understand the content well enough to know what they were actually about. She paused. Carol is willing to provide a formal statement. She said she's been waiting for someone to ask. He sat with that for a moment. Carol Ferris had worked for Victoria for 4 years. He'd met her a dozen times, maybe more. She'd always been efficient, pleasant in a professional way. The kind of person who seemed to know where everything was and didn't call attention to herself. He tried to imagine what it had been like, working that closely with someone and carrying whatever Carol had been carrying. Has she said what she knew? Ethan asked. Not everything. She said she wants to talk through it properly, with the attorney present. Madeline's voice shifted slightly. But she told me one thing off the record. She said Victoria came to her about 2 months before everything collapsed, and told her that if anyone ever asked, Carol should say she had no direct knowledge of the Meridian account. Just that, nothing else. And Carol said okay because that was how she'd survived 4 years with Victoria. You said okay, and you didn't ask follow-up questions. Ethan looked at the wall above his desk, the paint scuff he still hadn't gotten around to fixing. He'd started to think of it as a landmark. She must have seen it coming, he said. The collapse. She was already managing the story. 2 months ahead, Madeline confirmed, which means the timeline in the letter, the 18 months of setup, probably undersells it. She may have been thinking about the exit even earlier. He thought about that. He thought about Victoria sitting across a dinner table from him, in the period she'd have been briefing Carol on the appropriate non-answers to give investigators, talking about their future with what had seemed like genuine investment in it. He didn't know if she'd been performing then, or if some part of it had been real. He suspected, based on everything he'd read and everything Kowalski had told him, and the single strange conversation with Eleanor at his kitchen table, that the answer was both, and that the complexity of it was something he'd probably never fully resolve. He found he was less consumed by that question than he'd expected to be. What she'd felt was her business. What she'd done was the part that mattered. There's something else, Madeline said. She said it carefully, like someone stepping onto a surface they weren't certain would hold. Okay. I've been going through some personal correspondence from Victoria's apartment. Letters, notes, things Eleanor asked me to sort through and catalog. Most of it is what you'd expect. Business correspondence, some personal letters from friends. She stopped. There's a notebook. Not a journal exactly, more like notes to herself. She kept one going back years. The entries aren't dated, so I can't place them precisely in the timeline. He waited. There are entries about you. She said it without inflection, just as information. About the relationship, about the decision she made regarding the Meridian account. Some of them they're not what I expected, given everything else. Some of them read like she was arguing with herself, trying to justify something she already knew she couldn't justify. Pause. I don't know if you want to see them. Kowalski doesn't think they're necessary for the legal case. The letter is sufficient. This is a separate question. He turned his chair toward the window. It was late afternoon, the light going flat and gray the way it did at this time of year, the city outside his window looking tired and utilitarian. What kind of entries, he said. The kind that suggests she understood what she was doing in real time. Madeline's voice was careful. Not just in retrospect. There are entries from the middle of the 18 months. She knew it was wrong while she was doing it. She kept going anyway, but she knew. He was quiet for a long time. I'll think about it, he said. Of course. No pressure either way. I just thought you deserved to know it existed. Can I ask you something? Yes. What is this like for you? He wasn't sure why he asked it. It came out before he decided to say it. Going through her things, finding all of this. She was your cousin. A silence, long enough that he wondered if it had been the wrong question. It's strange, Madeline said finally. I keep finding things that make me feel like I didn't know her at all. And then I find something else that reminds me of who she was when we were young, before the business, before the money. And I recognize her completely. And then I don't know which version of those things is true. Maybe both, he said. Maybe. Another pause. People are usually more than one thing. I just didn't expect the range to be quite this wide. He thought about that later, after they hung up. People are usually more than one thing. He'd been telling himself a version of that for 3 years, holding the memory of Victoria at 26 against the evidence of what she'd done, trying to make them cohere, failing, trying again. He hadn't found a way to make them cohere. He wasn't sure they were supposed to. But Madeline had said it without bitterness, just as an observation about the world, the way you'd state something you'd found to be true and had not enjoyed finding. He thought, she must be an exhausting person to deceive. The observation came and went. He moved on. Golt. The letter from his former employer arrived on a Thursday, 6 weeks after Kowalski had sent his initial communication to their legal department. It was formal and measured. The language of institutional caution. Not an apology, exactly, because institutions rarely apologize directly for anything, but a notification that an internal review of his case had been reopened in light of newly available documentation, and that the preliminary findings of that review indicated the basis for his suspension had been substantially compromised by information that had not been available to the original investigative committee. They were rescinding the suspension designation from his employment record. They were restoring his status in good standing. They were prepared to provide letters of professional reference upon request. He read it 3 times standing at the kitchen counter. Sophie was at school. The apartment was quiet. He'd spent 3 years carrying the specific weight of professional disgrace, the knowledge that somewhere in a file, in a database, in the collective memory of an industry he'd given his best working years to, there was a notation that said he had been found wanting. That weight had become so familiar, he'd stopped noticing it as a separate thing, the way you stop noticing a sound that's always present. It had just become part of the texture of the life he was living. Now someone was saying the notation was wrong. He put the letter down. He picked it up again. He walked to the window and back. He called Kowalski. I saw it, the attorney said before Ethan could speak. They copied me. It's a good start. A start? The letter is significant, but it's internal. The analyst certification, the revocation through the industry association, that's a separate process, and it's going to take longer. Kowalski was already in communication with the association. The Wald connection was proving useful, he said, though difficult. Christopher Wald had left his board position the previous year and was currently not responding to correspondence. But this matters, Kowalski said. Don't minimize it. This is your employer saying on the record that they were wrong. That document has weight. I know. He watched a pigeon on the windowsill negotiate with its own reflection in the glass. I know it matters. Are you all right? The question surprised him. Kowalski didn't usually ask questions like that. I don't know, Ethan said honestly. It should feel better than it does. Maybe it will later. That's common, Kowalski said. People expect vindication to feel a certain way. It usually doesn't, not right away. It comes in slower than the damage did. He thought about that after he hung up. The damage had been fast, 2 weeks, and his career was gone. His savings moved, his name in the records of a finance firm's HR department as a man who had been removed for cause. Fast and total, like a building with a compromised foundation that comes down all at once. The repair was going to take longer. That was how repair usually worked. He understood that intellectually. He was working on understanding it in his body. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop and spent the afternoon doing his data entry work with a strange, suspended feeling, like a man waiting for something to arrive that he'd been told was coming but hadn't seen yet. When he picked up Sophie from school, she could tell. She didn't say anything during the walk home, which was unlike her. She usually filled the walk with a running account of the day's events, arranged in an order that reflected importance to her rather than chronology. Today, she walked beside him and looked at the sidewalk and then looked at him sideways and then looked at the sidewalk again. What? He said. You look different. Different how? She thought about it with the concentration she brought to most things. Like something happened. Something did happen. Good or bad. He looked at his daughter, at her serious face turned up toward him on the sidewalk, her backpack pulling slightly at her shoulders because she insisted on carrying all her books, even when she didn't need them. He thought about the letter sitting on his kitchen counter. He thought about Raymond Kowalski saying, "This is your employer saying on the record that they were wrong." He thought about 3 years of carrying something that had never been his to carry. Good, he said. I think it was good. Sophie seemed to accept this. She took his hand. She still did that sometimes, without ceremony, as though it were a practical decision rather than an emotional one. And they walked the rest of the way home together. He made pasta for dinner, not because it was the easiest thing, though it was, but because it was what they'd been eating the night Eleanor Hale knocked on the door and put a box on his kitchen table and said, "I think you deserve to know." He wasn't sure why he wanted the echo of it. He just did. After dinner, Sophie did her homework at the kitchen table while he cleaned up, and she told him about a project the class was doing about community structures, how cities were organized, how neighborhoods worked, what made some places feel like places, and others feel like just locations. Her teacher had assigned each student a role. Sophie had been assigned urban planner. What does an urban planner do? She asked, with her pencil hovering. He thought of Madeline Brooks, very methodical. Eleanor trusts her completely. They figure out how spaces should work, he said. They look at a neighborhood or a block or a whole city, and they think about what it needs to be a good place to live. What's missing? What's in the wrong spot? What would make it better for the people who are already there? Sophie wrote something down. How do they know what it needs? They pay attention, he said. They look at how people actually move through a space, what they actually use, what they avoid. They don't assume they know. They look. She wrote something else down, nodding in the particular way she had when information was being filed correctly. That sounds like a hard job. It probably is, he said. I think the people who are good at it are the ones who don't mind looking at something and seeing it for what it actually is, not what they wanted it to be. Sophie put her pencil down and considered this. Like with the horse legs, she said. He looked at her. My teacher said the same thing, that I was drawing what I thought a horse's legs looked like instead of what they actually look like. She frowned at her paper. It's annoying when people are right about things like that. It usually is, he agreed. He finished cleaning up and Sophie finished her homework and they read their chapter, and she went to bed, and Ethan sat in the kitchen for a while in the quiet, with the letter from his employer on the counter beside him and the Kowalski filings in a folder on the table and the box, now empty of its documents, which had been cataloged and organized in a box of his own, sitting on the shelf by the front door. He thought about the notebook Madeline had mentioned, the entries from the middle of the 18 months, when Victoria had apparently kept a running account of what she was doing and the fact that she knew it was wrong. He hadn't told Madeline yes or no yet. He was still sitting with the question of whether it would help him to read it or just complicate things that were finally beginning to clarify. He thought about the letter on the counter, about what Kowalski had said. It comes in slower than the damage did. He thought about Sophie asking what urban planners did and his own answer, and the strange sideways quality of a conversation that had somehow been about two things at once without intending to be. He turned the kitchen light off. He went to bed. He didn't know yet what he was going to do about the notebook, but for the first time in 3 years, the not knowing felt like a choice rather than a sentence. The difference was small and significant, and he was going to let himself have it. He called Madeline back 4 days later and told her he wanted to see the notebook. He'd gone back and forth on it more times than he'd expected. There were mornings when the answer felt obvious. Why would he willingly read more evidence of a person calculating his destruction, in real time, in her own private handwriting? He had enough. He had the letter, the documents, the forged signatures, the cultivated witnesses. He didn't need more. And then there were other moments, usually late, when he understood that his hesitation wasn't really about protecting himself from additional pain. It was about something closer to fear. Fear that reading those entries would complicate the clean shape of what he now knew, that she had done this deliberately and without justification, by introducing something more human and therefore harder to hold at a distance. He decided, finally, that he was tired of managing his own distance from things. Madeline suggested they meet at a coffee place near the public library, neutral ground, somewhere neither of them had associations with. She said she'd bring the notebook. He recognized her from across the room when he walked in, though they'd never met. He recognized her the way you sometimes recognize people you'd only spoken to on the phone, something in the way she was sitting, the posture of someone who had come prepared and was waiting without impatience. She was in her early 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was more interesting than conventionally pretty. She was reading something on her phone, and she looked up when he came in, and put the phone down, and didn't smile in a way that tried too hard. "Mr. Carter." "Ethan," he said. He sat down across from her. "You're younger than I expected." "You're more tired-looking than I expected," she said, and then caught herself. "Sorry, that came out wrong." "No, it's accurate." He flagged down a server. "I haven't been sleeping particularly well." "That's understandable." They ordered coffee and sat for a moment in the slightly awkward territory of two people who knew a great deal about each other through the medium of a dead woman's crimes, and had never actually spoken face to face. "How's the process going?" she asked. "Slowly, which is what Kowalski keeps telling me to expect, so I'm trying to adjust my expectations accordingly." He looked at her. "The association certification is the last major piece. Kowalski is still trying to reach Christopher Wald." Madeline's expression shifted slightly. "I might be able to help with that." "How?" Wald knew Victoria socially. They moved in overlapping circles for about 3 years. There's a woman in that circle named Frances Atlee, who I know through a professional conference we both attended. Frances and Wald have stayed in contact. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I can ask Frances to make an introduction." "It's not guaranteed." But Wald not responding to an attorney's letter is different from Wald not responding to a call from someone in his social network. Ethan looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I think about most things more than is probably necessary." She said it without apology. Occupational hazard. When you spend your professional life trying to figure out why a neighborhood isn't working the way it should, you develop the habit of looking at the full system instead of just the obvious problem. And what's the obvious problem here? The obvious problem is the legal case. The full system includes the fact that your professional certification was revoked based on corrupted testimony, and that the person whose testimony was most directly responsible has been unreachable, and that unreachable doesn't mean unmovable. She paused. "I'll call Frances this week if you want me to." "Yeah," he said. I want you to. She reached into the bag beside her chair and placed the notebook on the table between them. It was a standard composition notebook, the black and white cover kind, slightly worn at the corners. He looked at it without picking it up. I marked the relevant entries with tabs, Madeline said. You don't have to read the whole thing. Most of it is business notes, projections, meeting summaries, things like that. The personal entries are scattered throughout. How many? About a dozen that relate directly to the Meridian account and to you. She kept her voice even. A few others that relate to you in ways that are less directly about the fraud. He looked at her. What does that mean? She considered how to say it. It means that whatever she felt about you, whatever the actual emotional content of the relationship was, it wasn't entirely manufactured. Some of those entries are from very early in the relationship, before Meridian existed, before the setup began. She paused. I don't know what to do with that information, as it applies to the legal case. Kowalski says it doesn't apply. But I thought you should know what's in there before you read it, so you're not blindsided. He picked up the notebook. The cover was smooth under his fingers, slightly warped at one edge from what might have been water damage. He opened to the first tab. The entry was dated about 18 months before the collapse. He recognized the timeline immediately. It was the period Kowalski had identified as the beginning of the setup, when the secondary authorization structure was being arranged and the Clearwater entity was being established. He read it slowly. The Meridian structure is in place. R confirmed the authorization amendment cleared through the Tuesday filing batch. E didn't flag it, which means either he didn't read closely enough or he trusts me not to put anything in front of him that would hurt him. I think it's the second one. That's the part I keep coming back to. He trusts me in that particular uncomplicated way that some people have and most people pretend to have. I'm not sure I've ever had it, and I don't know if that's a deficiency or just how I'm made. He moved to the second tab. This entry was from about 4 months later. Douglas P. delivered the compliance memo today, which means the internal picture at E's firm is starting to take the shape I needed. I've been careful. Nothing traceable, nothing direct, just the long patience of planting doubt and letting people's own anxieties do the rest of the work. People want an explanation for things that go wrong. They want someone to have been careless or dishonest. It makes the world feel more legible. I'm giving them legibility. I should feel more satisfied with how this is progressing. I don't particularly. That's new. He read the entry twice. Then he turned to the third tab. This one was shorter. Just a few lines, no date, written in a hand that was slightly different from the others. Quicker, less controlled, like something written fast. Sophie is 6 months old. E sent a photo. I didn't respond. I told myself it was because there was nothing to say that wouldn't complicate the timeline. That's probably even true. It's not the only thing that's true. He closed the notebook. He sat with his hands flat on the cover and looked at the table for a moment. Madeline didn't say anything. She just let the silence be what it was. She knew about Sophie from the beginning, he said. Yes. He'd known that, technically. The letter had said, I know that Sophie exists. But knowing it and reading an entry where she'd received a photo and chosen not to respond and written about that choice in real time were different categories of knowing. What made her keep writing in this, he said. It wasn't really a question for Madeline, but Madeline answered it anyway. I think some people use writing the way other people use other things, she said. Not to understand themselves better, just to release pressure, like a valve. You write it down so it stops pressing against you from the inside, and you don't have to actually reckon with it. He thought about the letter. The 3 pages on personal stationery that Victoria had apparently written and sealed and kept and never sent. The entries in this notebook that read like a person arguing with herself and then filing the argument away. She never intended for any of this to be found, he said. No. I think she intended to destroy it all. She just kept not doing it. He looked at Madeline across the table. She was watching him with the particular attention of someone who was not trying to manage his reaction, just observing it, with the respect of someone who understood that what he was going through was his to go through. Does it change anything for you? She asked. Reading it? He thought about that honestly. It makes her more real, he said, which I wasn't sure I wanted, but I think I needed it. He turned the notebook over in his hands once. It's easier to be angry at something you've turned into a symbol. I'd been doing that, turning her into a symbol of something that happened to me. This makes that harder. He set the notebook down. I don't know if that's better or worse. Maybe it's just more accurate, Madeline said. He looked at her. You say things like that. Like what? Like you've thought about whatever the question is until you found the most honest version of it, and then you just say that without cushioning it. She considered that. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's not. Madeline called Francis Attlee the following week. Ethan heard about it from Kowalski, who heard about it from Madeline, which meant the information arrived with the slightly compressed quality of third-hand news. What he understood was that Francis had made the introduction, and that Wald had agreed to a phone call, and that the phone call had lasted 40 minutes and had apparently involved Wald doing a significant amount of talking about things that had been bothering him for some time. Kowalski called Ethan on a Tuesday evening while he was doing the dishes. Wald talked, the attorney said, with a satisfaction he wasn't quite containing. At length. Ethan turned the faucet off. What did he say? He said that approximately 2 years before your certification was revoked, he received professional guidance from someone he described as a trusted industry contact regarding your conduct and judgment. He said this guidance was delivered informally, conversations, not documents. He said it shaped his view of your professional character before any formal review was initiated. She got to him directly, Ethan said. She got to him directly, Kowalski confirmed. He didn't know at the time that he was being managed. He believed he was receiving collegial intelligence about someone in the industry. He says now that when he looks back at how those conversations were structured, he can see what was happening. He was being primed the same way Park and Solanke were, just through a different channel. Is he willing to make a formal statement? He's already retained an attorney to advise him on the process. He's concerned about his own exposure, about having participated, even unknowingly, in a process that damaged your career. I've told him that our interest is in the record, not in assigning him blame. A pause. He was not a malicious actor. He was a person who trusted a source he had no reason to distrust. That's different from Douglas Park, who received demonstrable favors. Ethan put a wet bowl in the drying rack and leaned against the counter. Through Sophie's door, he could hear her talking to herself. The nightly narration, the story that had no beginning or ending. He listened to it for a moment without being able to hear the actual words. This gets the certification back, he said. If Wald's statement corroborates the documentation, and I believe it will, then yes. The association will have no basis for maintaining the revocation. A complaint had to be filed for it to happen, and the complaint was predicated on information we can now demonstrate was manufactured. Kowalski paused. I want to be careful about timelines. This is still a process, but the direction is clear. How long? For the formal reinstatement? 6 to 8 weeks once Wald's statement is filed. He paused. You've been patient. I haven't had another option. You could have been impatient. It would have made everything slower and harder. You weren't. The attorney's voice shifted to something a little less formal. I've worked cases like this before. Not this specific architecture, but the same general shape. Someone's life is taken apart by someone they trusted. Most people who go through it come out of the legal process angrier than they went in. The process confirms that something terrible happened, and the confirmation makes it realer, and the anger has nowhere to go. He paused. You seem like you're managing that. I'm managing it approximately, Ethan said. That's enough. After he hung up, he finished the dishes and went to Sophie's room and opened the door a crack. She was in bed, technically, the lights off, but he could hear her still murmuring in the dark. The running story. The horse with the multicolored mane finding her way through whatever landscape was being decided tonight. Sophie. I'm sleeping, she said immediately. You're narrating. A pause. I can do both. He leaned in the doorway. Good news today. Yeah? Yeah, something I've been waiting for looks like it's going to work out. He heard her roll over in the dark. The hard thing you're figuring out? Part of it. Is it done? Almost, not quite. But it's going to be okay. He thought about Christopher Wald talking for 40 minutes on a phone call, saying things that had apparently been bothering him for some time. He thought about Carol Ferris, who had been waiting for someone to ask. He thought about Eleanor Hale setting a box on his kitchen table with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something she'd been carrying for too long. "Yeah," he said. "It's going to be okay." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, "Comet made it through the mountain pass today." "Did she?" "It was hard. There was ice, but she knew the way, even in the dark, because she'd memorized the landmarks." Another pause. "That's the thing about knowing a place well. You don't need to see it." He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the shape of his daughter in the dark. "Go to sleep," he said. "I know," she said. He had coffee with Madeline again 3 weeks later, and then again the week after that. The second time, they didn't talk about the case at all for the first hour. They talked about her work, a project she was leading on a mixed-income development in the east part of the city, the specific problem of designing a neighborhood that served existing residents without inadvertently pricing them out of the surrounding area. She talked about it with the focused energy of someone who found their work genuinely worth thinking about, which was not something he encountered as often as he would have liked, and he listened with the attention he used to give to things before the last 3 years had compressed his range. "The mistake most people make," she said, "is designing for an idealized version of the community. The people they hope will live there, the behaviors they assume people will have, and then the actual people don't fit the design, and everyone's frustrated. You design for who's actually there." "I try to. It's harder than it sounds, because what's actually there is messy and contradictory, and sometimes what people need is in direct conflict with what they say they want." She picked up her coffee. "But if you don't start from what's real, you end up with a beautiful plan that doesn't serve anyone." He thought about what Kowalski had said during their first meeting. The infrastructure was built first. The outcome was the intended outcome. He thought about someone designing a collapse from the ground up, building toward a specific conclusion, and how different that was from Madeline's description of design, starting from what was real, trying to serve people as they actually were. "What made you go into urban planning?" he asked. She thought about it. He appreciated that she thought about it instead of reaching for the easy answer. "I grew up in a neighborhood that got redeveloped badly," she said. "I was 12. They put in this new housing development that was supposed to improve things, and it looked great on paper, and everyone who designed it had good intentions. And then the actual people who lived there couldn't afford the new businesses that came in, and the community spaces got repurposed into things no one in the neighborhood actually used, and within 5 years the neighborhood was mostly people who hadn't been there before." She set the cup down. "I wanted to understand how that happens, and then I wanted to understand how to make it not happen." He looked at her across the table. "You're still angry about it." "I'm still motivated about it," she said. "There's a difference. Anger without direction is just noise." She glanced at him. "You know that better than I do at this point." It was the first direct reference she'd made to his situation in weeks, and she said it simply, without drama, and he found he didn't mind it. "I'm learning it," he said. The third coffee turned into a walk. They ended up in a park neither of them had planned to be in, following a path along a narrow creek that ran through the east side of the neighborhood, and Madeline pointed out things about the park's design as they walked. The placement of the benches relative to the path, the way the plantings had been chosen without adequate consideration for seasonal variation, a small amphitheater that she said had been built for community events and had never actually hosted one because the acoustics were wrong. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "I read the planning documents for most of the developments in this part of the city. It's either a professional habit or a personality problem." She stepped over a root that crossed the path. "Probably both." Sophie would have called this a trail worth remembering, he thought. She would have named something here. The fourth time they met, he brought Sophie. It wasn't planned. His usual arrangement for the afternoons had fallen through. The neighbor who sometimes watched Sophie for an hour had a conflict, and he was going to reschedule, but Madeline said, "Bring her. It's fine. I like kids." And he believed her because she said it without the particular performance that people who didn't actually like kids deployed when they felt obligated to claim otherwise. Sophie studied Madeline with the frank assessment of a child who had not yet learned to disguise her evaluations. She asked Madeline what urban planners did, and Madeline explained it differently than he had. She talked about maps and how you could look at a map and see where people actually went versus where the map said they should go, And sometimes those two things were very different, and your job was to figure out why. Sophie thought about this. Like how everyone cuts through the corner of the schoolyard even though there's a path that goes around. Madeline looked at her with what appeared to be genuine delight. Exactly like that. That's called a desire path. When people make their own trails because the official ones don't go where they actually need to go. Sophie turned this over. So you make the paths go where people already go? That's one way to think about it. Sophie looked at Ethan. Dad, you should have explained it like that. I did my best, he said. Your best was not as good as her best. Sophie said it without cruelty, just as information, and went back to studying the menu. Madeline caught his eye across the table and didn't quite suppress a smile. He didn't quite suppress one either. It was the first time in he couldn't remember how long that he'd sat across a table from someone and felt, briefly, like himself. Not the version of himself who was managing a legal process, or surviving a reduced life, or protecting his daughter from the residue of something she was too young to understand. Just himself, in a coffee shop, having a normal afternoon. He didn't make anything of it at the time. He just let it be what it was. The formal reinstatement letter from the Industry Association arrived 7 weeks after Wald's statement was filed, which was 1 week ahead of Kowalski's estimate. It was a single page. It stated in the careful language of institutions correcting their mistakes that the revocation of his financial analyst certification had been issued in error, that the basis for the original complaint had been found to be substantially unreliable, and that his standing had been restored effective immediately. He read it once. Then he sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. He thought about the morning he'd received the original notice of revocation. A Tuesday. He remembered that specifically, because Sophie had a pediatrician appointment that afternoon, and he'd been trying to hold himself together through it, asking the doctor the normal questions about weight and development and vaccination schedule, while carrying the news in his chest like a stone. The doctor had asked if everything was okay with him, and he'd said yes, and she'd looked at him for a moment and then let it go. He'd spent that night after Sophie was asleep sitting at this same table, in this same chair, with a different document that had said something different. He called Kowalski. I saw it, the attorney said. Copied. It's over? The primary legal components are resolved. There are a few administrative processes still running. The credit bureau updates will take another couple of months to fully propagate. The estate restitution is scheduled for disbursement next month. He paused. But yes, the substantive work is done. Ethan put his hand flat on the letter. I want to do something for Eleanor. She doesn't want anything. I know she doesn't want anything. I want to do it anyway. A pause. I'll let her know you called. He also called James, who made a sound that wasn't quite words, and then said, good, with a completeness that meant more than the word. He called his mother, who cried in the quiet, controlled way she cried when she was trying not to be a burden about it, and who asked if she could take Sophie for the weekend next month. And he said yes, absolutely yes. Take her for the whole week if you want. He sat for a while after the calls. Then he picked up his phone and sent Madeline a text message. It's done. The reinstatement came through today. I wanted you to know since you're part of why. She replied within 10 minutes. I'm glad. How are you doing? He looked at the question. He thought about the honest answer. Still figuring that out, he typed. But differently than before. She sent back, that sounds like progress. He set his phone down and looked at the letter on the table, and at the reinstatement notice, and at the kitchen that was quiet in the midday way. It was always quiet. Sophie at school, the city going about its business outside the window, the radiator ticking in the corner. He thought about what Kowalski had said months ago. It comes in slower than the damage did. He was starting to understand that. The damage had arrived all at once, a single terrible winter, and had seemed total and permanent. The repair was coming in pieces, over months, each piece smaller than he'd hoped, and more significant than he'd expected. The reinstatement letter was a piece. The restitution was a piece. The conversation with James over chili was a piece. Sophie's desire paths, and Madeline's direct way of saying true things, and Eleanor Hale standing at his door with a box she'd driven across the city to deliver, all pieces, accumulating. He didn't feel whole yet. He didn't think that was how it worked, that a document arrived and you felt whole. But he felt, sitting at his kitchen table in the middle of a Tuesday, like a man who had been handed back something that belonged to him and was still learning the weight of it. The particular shape of a thing that had been missing so long, he'd stopped remembering exactly what it felt like to have it. He folded the reinstatement letter and put it in the drawer where he kept important documents. Then he opened his laptop and started looking, for the first time in 3 years, at financial analyst job postings. He didn't apply to anything that day. He wasn't ready. But he looked and he made a few notes, and he thought about what he wanted the next version of his life to look like. Not the version he'd had before, which had been good, but had also, he could see now, been missing some things he'd been too busy to notice were absent. He thought about that until it was time to pick up Sophie. Then he closed the laptop and got his jacket and went. The restitution check arrived on a Thursday in late March, delivered by courier to Kowalski's office, and forwarded the same afternoon with a brief note in the attorney's handwriting. Estate disbursement. As agreed. Call me when you've had a chance to sit with it. Ethan sat with it for about 40 minutes. $231,000. The number on the check was precise in the way that legal settlements were precise. Calculated to the dollar, the product of months of accounting and negotiation, and the careful mathematics of restitution. He'd known the amount was coming. He'd known it for months. Seeing it printed on a check in his hand was something different from knowing it, the same way reading about a place in a book was different from standing in it. He called Kowalski. "The first thing I want to do," Ethan said without preamble, "is pay James back. That's been coordinated through the estate separately. Your brother should receive his payment directly within the week." "I know. I want to pay him myself, too, on top of what the estate sends." A pause. "That's your choice to make." "I know that, too." He looked at the check. "What's the process from here?" Kowalski walked him through it, the account the funds needed to clear through, the remaining administrative pieces, the timeline for the credit bureau corrections to fully propagate, which the attorney estimated at another 6 to 8 weeks. He said it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man wrapping up a job well done, which was what it was, and Ethan listened and took notes on a pad of paper the way he used to take notes in meetings, when he'd been someone who went to meetings. After they hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes, the check in front of him, and thought about his grandfather. The $200,000 he'd put into the Meridian account had been accumulated over 11 years of careful saving, plus a small inheritance from his grandfather, a quiet man who'd worked in insurance his whole life, and had somehow, through decades of modest living and methodical investment, left each of his 3 grandchildren enough money to matter. Ethan had thought about that inheritance often during the 3 years it was gone, not with bitterness exactly, more with a specific grief, the kind that attaches to things that can't be replaced because their meaning is connected to their source. He'd felt that he'd lost not just the money, but the proof that his grandfather had trusted him with something. He understood now that the loss hadn't been his failure, but he also understood that some things, once gone, couldn't be fully returned by a check. The money could come back. The years couldn't. The particular version of himself who'd been $47,000 from a down payment on an apartment, who'd had a plan and a partner and a reasonable belief that the future was pointing somewhere good, that version of himself was not coming back either. He thought that was worth sitting with honestly, rather than papering over with relief. The relief was also real. He didn't want to minimize it, but it was layered over something more complicated, the way most real things were layered. He put the check in the drawer with the reinstatement letter and closed it. Then he called Madeline. Okay. They'd developed over the preceding months the kind of rhythm that neither of them had named or discussed. A series of coffees and walks and occasional lunches that had no formal structure and no stated purpose beyond the fact of continuing. He would send a message when something happened in the case. She would respond with the particular directness he'd come to expect from her, and then, gradually, the case stopped being the main subject, and the things they talked about became the ordinary things of 2 people who were finding they preferred each other's company to most alternatives. She answered on the second ring. "The check came," he said. "How does it feel?" He thought about it. Strange, like putting a period at the end of a sentence that took 3 years to write. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to not talk about it?" "Neither, actually." He turned his chair toward the window. The city outside was doing the particular thing it did in late March, Suspended between winter and something warmer, the light changing quality without the temperature quite catching up. I wanted to tell you because you're the person I wanted to tell. That's all. Another pause. He could hear faintly the sound of her environment. She was at her office, he thought, or maybe at a site. Some quality of open space. I'm glad you told me, she said, and then with the characteristic directness that he'd stopped being surprised by and started simply appreciating. Ethan, do you want to have dinner? Not coffee, actual dinner. He looked at the window. Yes. Friday. I'll find a place. Okay. And bring Sophie, she added. She'll have opinions about the menu. She has opinions about everything. I know. I find it refreshing. He smiled at the window. Friday, he said. Dinner was at a small Italian place that Madeline had clearly chosen with care, the kind of restaurant that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. Good food, close tables, the gentle noise of a room where other people were also having their evenings. Sophie studied the menu with the concentration she brought to important documents and then announced that she wanted the pasta with the sauce that wasn't the red one and wasn't the white one. The pink one, the server said. That one, Sophie confirmed with satisfaction. Madeline ordered something with mushrooms. Ethan ordered whatever the server recommended when he admitted he couldn't decide, which was a thing he'd never done before in a restaurant, just handed the choice off entirely, let someone else's judgment carry it, and he found it more comfortable than he expected. Sophie, Madeline said after the server left, I have a question for you. Sophie looked up. If you were designing a neighborhood, a whole neighborhood, from scratch, what's the first thing you'd put in it? Sophie didn't hesitate. A stable. For horses. Comet could live there, and other horses. She arranged her napkin with some deliberateness, and people could come visit them, and the horses could go out on trails. But there would be rules. You'd have to earn it. Earn access to the trails. Earn the horses' trust. She looked at Madeline with the particular expression she got when she felt a point wasn't being fully grasped. They're particular. You can't just show up and expect them to let you. Madeline nodded seriously. That's actually a sound community planning principle. Sophie looked at her. Is it? Spaces that just let anyone in without any investment from the person tend not to be valued. The things people work for, they take care of. Sophie processed this. Then she looked at Ethan. She's smart. I know, he said. Smarter than your work friends. I don't really have work friends yet, he said. When you do, Sophie said, returning to her water glass, she should be one of them. Madeline caught his eye over Sophie's head and looked away, but not before he'd seen the expression on her face. Something warm and a little undone. The expression of someone who hadn't expected a 7-year-old to get to them and had been gotten to anyway. He understood the feeling. The job came through in April. It wasn't the same firm. He hadn't applied there and wasn't sure he would have, even if they'd offered. It was a mid-sized investment management company on the north side, the kind of place run by people who'd left larger firms to do things they had more control over. The interview process had been direct and the role was real, and when they called to offer it, he sat in his car in a parking garage for 10 minutes before calling anyone because he needed to just sit in the fact of it first. It had been 4 years since he'd worked in his actual field. 4 years of data entry consulting that paid the minimum required and no more. Of contracting himself out to whoever needed spreadsheets managed. Of applying skills built over a decade of serious professional work to tasks that used approximately 5% of what he knew how to do. He hadn't complained about it because it had been what he needed and he'd understood what he needed, but he'd felt the diminishment of it in a way that was hard to articulate to anyone who hadn't experienced it. He called James first. The analyst job, his brother said immediately. Yes? James made the sound he made when something landed right. A short exhale, satisfied. When do you start? 3 weeks. We should do something, celebrate. Let's just do the chili again, Ethan said. You and your comfort food. You're the one who makes it. Because you can't figure out the cumin. A pause, and then his brother's voice went quieter. I'm proud of you. I should say that more, and I don't. He He sat in the parking garage and looked at the concrete pillar in front of him. You say it when it counts. Does this count? Yeah, he said. This counts. He called his mother next. She cried predictably and without apology and asked if this meant he was thinking about a bigger apartment, and he said he was thinking about it. And she said she'd been keeping an eye on real estate listings in his neighborhood the way she kept an eye on most things that concerned her children, which was to say, constantly and without being asked. He told her that was invasive. She told him that was the job. He called Madeline last. April 12th, she said when he told her the start date. Sophie has school. I have a site meeting in the morning. Let's have lunch. That's how you celebrate, he said. It's how I mark things that matter, she said. I don't need a party. I need to sit across from someone and look at their face and understand that something good happened. He thought about that for a moment. Lunch, he said. April 12th. He told Eleanor Hale in person. He'd called her the week after the restitution check arrived and asked if she'd be willing to meet, and she'd said yes without hesitation, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for the call. They met at a tea room near her apartment, her suggestion, a quiet place that seemed like a natural extension of her, unhurried and without pretension. She looked older than when she'd appeared at his door 8 months earlier, not dramatically, just the way people aged incrementally, the weight of a year sitting differently on their face than the weight of the previous year. She'd lost her daughter not long ago. He kept that in mind. She poured tea and asked about Sophie, and he told her about the horse drawings and the neighborhood project and Sophie's theory of earned trust. And Eleanor smiled with a quality he recognized as genuine pleasure that was threaded through with something more complicated. She sounds like someone who knows her own mind, Eleanor said. She terrifies me sometimes, Ethan said, in the best way. Eleanor set her cup down and looked at him. How is it? He knew what she meant. It's getting there, he said. The reinstatement is done. The job starts next month. The credit will take a little longer, but Kowalski says it's moving. He paused. The money came through. I know. I instructed the estate attorney to send it the moment the last document cleared. I know you did. He looked at the woman across the table from him, this woman who had driven across the city with a box she hadn't been obligated to bring, who had hired an attorney to compile a case she hadn't needed to make, who had made her daughter's wrong her own responsibility to right, even though she hadn't done the wrong. I want you to understand something. Eleanor waited. What you did, he said, wasn't nothing. I know you know that. But I'm not sure you understand how much of the past 8 months would have been impossible without you starting it. Kowalski, the documentation, Wald, all of it. That chain started when you knocked on my door. He held her gaze. You could have not come. The estate would have settled, you would have kept the money that was legally yours, and I would have gone on carrying something I would never have been able to disprove. You chose not to do that. Eleanor's expression moved through several things quickly. She was my daughter, she said. What she did was wrong. I knew it was wrong. I couldn't live with knowing and not... She stopped. She started again. I'm not a person who carries things I could have put down. Neither am I, he said. Anymore. She looked at him with the particular attention of someone finding that a sentence landed somewhere accurate. That took time. Most things do. They sat for a while with their tea in the quiet of the room. He thought about the fact that this woman was, in some oblique and involuntary way, connected to everything that had nearly destroyed him, and that she was also, in a more direct way, connected to the process that had begun to put things right. Both things were true simultaneously. He was finding that was how most things worked, not cleanly, not in categories that stayed separate, but tangled together in ways that required you to hold multiple true things at once without resolving them into something simpler. He didn't say this to Eleanor. He just sat with her in the quiet, and they talked for a while longer about things that weren't the case, about Sophie's school, about a garden Eleanor was planning, about a book she'd read that she thought he might find interesting. Normal conversation, the kind that happens when two people have decided they're going to know each other. When he left, she walked him to the door of the tea room and said, "Come back," with the straightforwardness of someone who didn't say things they didn't mean. "I will," he said, and meant it. He proposed to Madeline on a Saturday in October outside the community center where she volunteered on alternating weekends, teaching a planning and design workshop to high school students who were learning to look at their neighborhoods and ask why things were the way they were. It wasn't a grand gesture. He hadn't rented a restaurant or hired a photographer or arranged for friends to be hiding somewhere. What had happened was that he'd been sitting on a bench outside the community center, waiting for her workshop to end, watching Sophie draw in a notebook she'd brought. She'd started filling notebooks with sketches and observations the way Madeline filled notebooks with planning notes, and whether she'd picked up the habit from watching Madeline or arrived at it independently was a question he'd stopped trying to answer, and he'd had the ring in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks. He'd bought it 6 weeks before that, in a small jewelry shop on a street he'd walked past dozens of times without going into. Nothing dramatic. He'd gone in, looked at what was available, found something that seemed like it was built to last rather than to impress, and bought it. The salesperson had asked if it was for a special occasion, and he'd said yes, and she'd asked what occasion, and he'd thought about it and said, "I found someone I trust," which wasn't a conventional answer, but it was the accurate one. He'd been waiting for the right moment, which he understood was not really something you waited for. The right moment was something you decided had arrived. Madeline came out of the community center at 4:30, pulling on her jacket, carrying a rolled tube of planning diagrams under one arm. She always came out of the workshops with evidence of what they'd been doing, maps and sketches the students had made. She saw him on the bench and Sophie beside him, and she smiled in the specific way she smiled when she found them where she'd left them. A smile that had accumulated meaning over the year they'd been together. She sat down next to him on the bench. "How was it?" he asked. "Good. There's a kid in there, 15 years old, who identified a transit gap in the East Corridor that the city's planning department has been ignoring for 6 years. She built the whole case from open-source data." She shook her head. "She's going to be formidable." "Desire paths again?" She mapped every unofficial crossing point in a 2-mile stretch and overlaid it on the official bus routes. "The gaps are obvious once you see them." She looked at him. "You have the expression." "What expression?" "The one where you're about to say something you've been sitting on." Sophie, without looking up from her notebook, said, "He's been like that for an hour." Ethan looked at his daughter. Sophie met his eyes briefly and then returned to her drawing with the elaborate nonchalance of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and had decided not to be responsible for it. He turned back to Madeline. He took the ring out of his jacket pocket and held it in his palm, and he didn't say anything that he'd rehearsed because he'd rehearsed several versions and none of them had sounded like him. What he said instead was what he actually thought, which was what she had always expected from him and was probably why she was still here. "I spent 3 years in a life that someone else had designed for me," he said. "Not a good design, built to fail, and when I finally had the chance to start over, I didn't really know what I was building toward. I just knew it had to be real. It had to be the actual thing, not a version of a thing." He looked at her face, which was still and open in the way it went when she was paying full attention. "You're the actual thing, Madeline. You and Sophie and this specific, imperfect, real version of a life we've been figuring out together." He closed his fingers around the ring briefly and then opened them again. "I want to keep figuring it out." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She looked at Sophie, who was still drawing with great concentration. "Sophie," Madeline said. Did you know about this?" Sophie turned a page. "I knew he had something in his pocket for a long time." A pause. "I thought maybe it was going to be longer. He's been nervous." "I haven't been nervous," Ethan said. "You made eggs for dinner twice this week," Sophie said. "You only do that when you're not thinking straight." Madeline looked back at Ethan. He thought she might be trying not to laugh. He was also trying not to laugh. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Yes," she said again, more firmly, the way she said things when she meant them without qualification. She took the ring from his palm and looked at it, and then put it on her own finger, which he hadn't expected, but which was exactly right, exactly Madeline, not waiting to be given something she'd already decided to have. Sophie looked up. She assessed the situation. She returned to her notebook. "Good," she said, with the satisfaction of someone confirming a prediction. "What?" Eleanor Hale arrived at the community center 20 minutes later. Ethan had called her the week before and asked if she'd be willing to come. He hadn't explained fully what was happening, just said he'd like her to be there for something, that it would mean something to him if she was. She'd asked what time and where without further questions, which was, he'd come to understand, entirely characteristic. She was sitting on a bench farther down the path when they found her, watching the park with the settled patience of someone who had learned, at some cost, how to wait without filling the waiting with noise. She looked up when they approached. He made the introduction simply. Madeline, Eleanor. Eleanor had heard about Madeline from Kowalski and from Ethan, and Madeline had, of course, known Eleanor's name for most of a year. They looked at each other with the particular assessment of two people who understood they shared a complicated history mediated by a dead woman, and then Madeline put out her hand and Eleanor took it. Sophie looked at Eleanor. "You're the one who brought the box," she said. Eleanor looked down at the small, serious face. "I am." "Dad said you drove it over yourself." "I did." Sophie considered this. "Why didn't you just mail it?" Eleanor glanced at Ethan. He spread his hand slightly, the gesture of a parent indicating they had no control over this particular situation. "Because some things need to be hand-delivered," Eleanor said, with the gravity she brought to most statements. "If something matters enough to be worth doing, it's worth going in person." Sophie thought about this. "My teacher says the same thing about apologies." "Your teacher's right." Sophie seemed to decide Eleanor had passed some internal assessment. She moved slightly closer to her on the bench, the way she did with people she'd determined were worth being close to, and went back to her notebook. Eleanor looked at Ethan over Sophie's head, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it. Not the composure she'd had at his door, not the careful steadiness of the tea room. Something softer and harder to name. The expression of a woman who had come to a park on a Saturday afternoon and found something she hadn't fully expected. He showed her Madeline's hand. The ring. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment. Her eyes, when she raised them, were wet in the way that people's eyes were when they'd decided not to cry, but the decision was costing them something. "Good," she said. Just that. But the word held a weight he understood. He thought about the night she'd appeared at his door, the cardboard box, the carefully labeled folders, the 3 pages of confession on personal stationery. He thought about how close he'd come to not opening the door, how he'd stood at the peephole looking at a woman in a gray coat, holding a box, looking directly back at him as though she knew she was being watched. Something in him had opened the door not because he'd known it was the right thing, but because he'd been too tired to keep the world out anymore. He was glad now for that particular exhaustion. He sat down on the bench beside Eleanor and Madeline sat on his other side, and Sophie narrated something quietly to her notebook, and the October afternoon went about its business around them. A dog walker negotiating 3 leashes, 2 kids on bicycles arguing about a route, the particular golden quality of fall light that made everything look like it was being remembered while it was still happening. He thought, this is a desire path. Not the one anyone would have designed, not the route the map suggested, but the one that people actually took, worn into the ground by the weight of real movement, leading somewhere the official plans hadn't accounted for. He thought about what Madeline said about those paths, that they happened because people needed to go somewhere the designed routes didn't take them, that a good planner didn't try to eliminate them, just looked at where they led and understood something true about what people actually needed. He thought he understood now, sitting on a park bench with a ring on Madeline's finger and Eleanor's wet eyes and Sophie's running quiet narration, what the desire path of his own life had been trying to find its way toward, through the detour of the worst 3 years he'd ever had. Not back to what had existed before. That place was gone, and some of it had deserved to go. Forward, to something that had been built from what was real rather than what was convenient, from the actual truth of what had happened, from the people who had chosen honesty over ease, from the slow accumulation of things that were small and genuine rather than large and false. He didn't say any of this out loud. It wasn't the kind of thing you said out loud in a park on a Saturday afternoon. It was the kind of thing you sat with quietly, in the company of people who made sitting with things feel like enough. Ishimat. This is the thing about betrayal that nobody tells you. The damage is fast and total, and the repair is slow and partial, and the partial nature of the repair is not a failure. It is just what repair looks like when you are honest about it. You do not come out of something like what Ethan Carter went through unchanged. The version of him who had put $200,000 into a joint venture with someone he trusted, who had believed that trust was a reasonable thing to extend without qualification, who had been planning a future without understanding that futures require verification as well as faith. That version of him was gone. He didn't grieve it exactly, because the loss had made room for things the former version of him hadn't known to want. But he also didn't pretend the loss hadn't happened. That was the thing he'd learned slowly and against his initial instincts over the course of the preceding year. The impulse to resolve difficult things into clean lessons, to extract the gift from the suffering and present it neatly. He'd felt that impulse, and had mostly refused it because it was a way of lying about how hard things actually were. What he believed instead was simpler and less satisfying and more true, that people were capable of deliberate cruelty and also, simultaneously, of genuine remorse, that an institution could fail you completely and then correct itself, that a woman could engineer the destruction of someone's life and still be something other than purely monstrous, without that complexity making what she'd done any less a destruction. That trust, once broken the way his had been broken, didn't rebuild in a straight line. It rebuilt in pieces, unevenly, at a pace that bore no relationship to what felt fair, and that sometimes the people who helped you find your way back were the ones you'd never have encountered any other way. An attorney with a rumpled sport coat who asked how you were doing in a tone that meant it. A woman who had known the person who hurt you and chosen accountability over comfort. A cousin who noticed something off in estate records because she was the kind of person who couldn't not notice, and followed the thread, and handed you the end of it without asking for anything back. He thought about something Sophie had said once, about Comet the horse, that she didn't let people ride her unless they'd earned it, that she was particular. He thought that was right. He thought you had to be particular after a while. Not shut down, particular. There was a difference. Shut down was a door that wouldn't open. Particular was a door that opened when the person knocking had been worth letting in. He was learning to tell the difference. It was slow work, and he was not always good at it. But he was doing it, imperfectly, in the way that most things worth doing got done. 6 months after the bench in the park, he and Madeline were married in a small ceremony at a garden venue that Madeline had selected with the same methodical attention she brought to site selection for anything. Not large, 30 people, the ones who had mattered, the ones who had stayed or arrived or earned their way in. James was there, looking slightly better than usual in a jacket he'd clearly bought specifically for the occasion. His mother was there, and she cried from the beginning and didn't stop, and nobody commented on this because it was accepted as simply what she did. Carol Ferris came, which surprised him, and then didn't. She'd been carrying her own version of the story for 4 years, and she'd made her statement, and being present at something good felt like the right bookend. Eleanor Hale sat in the second row. She wore the same gray coat. When Ethan caught her eye before the ceremony started, she gave him a small nod that meant what it needed to mean. Sophie was the flower girl, a role she had accepted with the solemnity of someone given a significant operational responsibility. She had opinions about the petals and the speed at which they should be distributed, and she had communicated these opinions to everyone involved in advance. She executed the role with characteristic precision and then stationed herself in the front row and watched the rest of the proceedings with the expression of someone who had decided the outcome was satisfactory. When it was over and they were standing outside in the late afternoon light, Madeline still in her dress, Ethan with his jacket off because the day had gone warmer than expected, Sophie came and stood between them and took one hand from each of them without preamble. "Now we're all in the same house," she announced. "Soon," Madeline said. They were still working out the logistics of the apartment situation, another imperfect, real thing being figured out in real time. Sophie looked at their joined hands. "Comet would approve," she said. "High praise," Ethan said. "It is." She dropped their hands and went to find James, who had promised her cake. Madeline leaned her shoulder against Ethan's, not dramatically, just the easy weight of someone who had decided this was where they were and found that sufficient. He looked out at the garden, at the 30 people eating and talking in the late sun, at Eleanor sitting with his mother in what appeared to be a conversation that had been going for a while and showed no signs of stopping, At James crouching down to Sophie's level at the dessert table with great apparent seriousness about the cake selection. He thought about a knock on a door at 4:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, about a cardboard box, about a woman who had looked directly at the peephole as if she'd known she was being watched. He thought about all the things that had to have happened for him to be standing here. Not just the good things, the attorney, the documentation, the letter, all of it. The betrayal too. The 3 years of reduced life, the data entry, the night sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee trying to understand how to keep moving. The version of himself who had stood outside his office building in November with his phone in his hand, learning that not everything broken can be explained away. He wouldn't have chosen any of it. He wouldn't choose it again. And he could not, standing here honestly, say that he would be standing here without it. That was the thing about desire paths. You didn't plan them. You walked in the direction you needed to go, over and over, until the path existed, until the ground held the shape of your movement, until what you'd been doing became visible as a route that led somewhere. He'd been walking for 3 years in the dark, by feel, toward something he couldn't name. It had turned out the something had a name after all. It just looked like a small girl who named her horses and enforced their trust. A woman who looked at broken things and figured out how they were supposed to work. A brother who showed up with groceries and didn't need everything to be resolved before he'd sit at the same table. A mother who kept a garden and watched real estate listings and cried at weddings without apology. An old woman in a gray coat who had driven across the city because some things needed to be hand-delivered. And a version of himself that had survived being deliberately disassembled and had put himself back together, not identically, not without seams, but genuinely, piece by piece. In the way that things which are built from what is real tend to last longer than the things built to impress. He felt Madeline's hand find his. He held it. The afternoon continued its ordinary business around them, gentle and unremarkable, the way the best things often were.